In this video lecture, I am going to explain what is session tracking using HttpSession. First of all, we'll discuss what is session. In a traditional sense, a session is simply the limited interval of time in which two systems communicate to each other. The system may be the client and server. However, in HTTP protocol, the state of the communication is not maintained. Means HTTP protocol is a stateless protocol. Hence, the web application that works on HTTP protocol use several different technologies that are session tracking, which means maintaining the state and its data. Simply, session tracking is nothing but identifying the client data and its states with current request. In order to achieve session tracking in servlets, cookie has been one of the most commonly used techniques. However, they are having different advantages of cookie. First advantage is they can only keep textual information. Second is the cookies are stored on browser. Hence, if the client disable them, your web application cannot make use of them. Individual cookie can contain not more than 4 KB of information. That is the biggest disadvantage of using cookie. So in this video lecture, we will use HttpSession for session tracking. HttpSession. What is HttpSession? HttpSession object is used to store the entire session with a specific client. We can store, retrieve, remove attributes from HttpSession object. Any servlet can access HttpSession using getSession method of the HTTP servlet class. Now we'll discuss how this HttpSession works. First, we have already discussed what is session tracking. Session tracking is identifying the client and its data with the current request. First, client makes the request. Now request will reach to the web container. In the web server, we are having web container, means servlet engine. Web container, once the request is new request, the web container will create one HTTP session. It will create one ID, that is ID 101, and it will store this HTTP session. It will store this ID in this HTTP session using set attribute, and now it will give to the client with this ID. Once again, if the same client will request, then the web container will search whether the ID is present into the HTTP session or not. If it is present, it won't create any HTTP ID. It will give the reference to the web client. Like this HTTP session works. First, one client's request, the web container generates a unique ID and give it back to the client with response. This is a temporary session created by web container. Second, the client sends back the ID with each request, making it easier for the web container to identify whether the client is coming from. The web container uses this ID and find the matching session ID and associate the session with the request. First, client will visit. Once it is the new request, the web container create one HTTP session and this ID is sent with the response, and once again it is visited, then in the HTTP session the web container will identify whether the client is visited or not. Now we'll see what are the steps to implement session tracking in HTTP session. First of all, we have to create the object of HTTP session. HTTP session object is request.getSession. HTTP session equal to request.getSession. Next, adding client data to the current request. Session object we have already created. Now session.set attribute, and in the parameter we have to pass name and value, string name and object value. If necessary, retrieve all the data contains in the HTTP session. How can you retrieve? Session.get attribute. Next, setting the lifetime of a session object. How can you set the lifetime of a HTTP session? Session.set max inactive interval, and in the bracket the time you have to give in the seconds. Session.set max inactive interval. In web.xml file you can pass the session timeout. Instead of set max inactive interval, you have another choice. You can pass the session timeout inside this web.xml. Session timeout inside this you have to pass in seconds, 30 seconds, and close the session timeout, close the session config. Inside this session config tag we are having session timeout. So once you have mentioned this 30 minutes, after the 30 minutes the session will inactive. And how can you invalidate the session? The last point is session.invalid. These are the steps. How can you create the session? How can you store the data? How can you retrieve the data? How can you set the time period of the HTTP session and using set max inactive interval, or you can pass inside the web.xml file session timeout. Thank you.